Welcome to my comprehensive final exam review explainer for Chapter 13. If you've been following along with our course material all semester, you know we've spent a ton of time discussing exactly how the adult criminal justice system operates, right? We've talked about why we punish and how we supervise offenders out in the community. Well, now we're going to unpack a really critical follow-up question. How do we handle those exact same issues when the offender is a developing child? So today, we're diving deep into the unique mechanics, the underlying philosophy, and the fascinating legal evolution of the juvenile justice system. Think of our agenda today as your ultimate exam syllabus. We're going to look at the big picture, trace the history and due process, walk through how juvenile courts actually operate, discuss waivers to adult court, look at rehabilitation and aftercare, and then wrap it all up with a final exam review. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the big picture. Let's tackle the absolute most foundational question of this entire chapter. Why do we treat children differently than adults in the eyes of the law? Well, it's because the juvenile justice system exists entirely separately from the adult criminal justice system, and it operates on a fundamentally different premise. Think about the adult system for a second. It is heavily focused on retribution and incapacitation. But the juvenile system, it was built from the ground up around rehabilitation and the best interests of the child. It actively recognizes that, hey, young brains are literally still developing. The goal here isn't just to issue a punishment, it's to correct the behavior, get to the root causes of the issue, and carefully balance that treatment with the very real need for public safety. Now, this brings us to a highly testable foundational term, so definitely write this down. It's called Parens Patriae. It's a Latin term, and it basically means the state acts as a parent. Under this philosophy, if parents were failing to properly raise, discipline, or care for their child, the state had the profound obligation to step in. They essentially became the ultimate overarching parent of every single child in the jurisdiction. And this concept, it completely shaped how early reformers built the entire system. Moving on to Part 2, history and due process. To understand how that absolute parental authority evolved into the modern court system we have today, we've got to look at the timeline. Looking at the origins, we really start back in 1825. Motivated by a desire to prevent youth from falling into poverty and crime, reformers established the New York House of Refuge. They assumed, and logically so at the time, that specialized, separate institutions could provide much better care than just throwing kids into adult jails. But actually, scratch that utopian vision for a second. It's worth noting that they often ended up just sweeping up poor or immigrant children simply for being on the streets. It definitely shows the rather dark side of early reform. Fast forward to the late 19th century, and a passionate group known as the Child Savers successfully argued that children shouldn't be treated as miniature adults in the eyes of the law. And this movement led directly to the creation of the very first juvenile court in 1899. But here's where the history gets a little complicated. Because those early courts acted like a strict parent under that Parens Patriae concept, they operated under a massive sweeping assumption that children didn't need constitutional rights. After all, a parent doesn't need a lawyer to discipline their child, right? Well, over time, this lack of oversight led to massive abuses of power, and eventually, the Supreme Court had to step in. This specific progression of landmark cases is absolutely crucial for your exam. It started in the 60s with the Kent and Gault decisions, which formalized basic rights like the right to an attorney. By the 70s, the Winship case demanded proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the Breed case applied protections against double jeopardy. And in our modern era, we have Roper and Graham. These cases took the absolute harshest adult sentences completely off the table for juveniles, ruling that you cannot execute anyone under 18, nor can you sentence them to life without parole for non-homicide offenses. So listen up, because I am highly likely to test you on this exact concept. If you see an essay question asking you to explain the evolution of juvenile due process, make sure you don't just give me a bulleted list of cases. Tell the story. Trace the progression from the early child savers, who actively denied rights in the name of treatment, all the way to the Supreme Court stepping in to systematically protect youth from the ultimate punishments of the adult system. Show me you understand the why behind the history. All right, Part 3, how juvenile courts operate. Now that we understand the legal foundation, let's explore the actual day-to-day mechanics of this specialized court. You need to be able to distinguish between 3 distinct types of cases that the juvenile court handles. First up are delinquency cases. These involve youth committing acts that would absolutely be considered crimes if they were adults. Second, we have dependency cases, where the court steps in because a child is being harmed or neglected by their parents. And third are status offenses. Circle this one in your notes. Status offenses are behaviors that are only illegal because of the person's age. We're talking about things like truancy, running away, or violating curfew. Now, when any of these cases enter the system, intake officers wield massive discretion. Very often, their primary goal is diversion. They want to use case management, family treatment, or community programs to address the behavior without ever formally processing the child through the court system. But if diversion isn't appropriate, the case moves forward. And language matters immensely here, because the entire goal is to avoid slapping a permanent, highly stigmatizing criminal label on a developing teenager. So the terminology shifts completely. An adult faces a criminal trial where a prosecutor seeks a guilty verdict. But a juvenile? They face an adjudication hearing. And if the evidence meets the burden of proof, the judge doesn't pronounce them guilty. Rather, they are found to be involved in delinquency. See the difference? The same logic applies to the outcome. The adult system relies on sentencing, which, as we know, is frequently rooted in retribution or incapacitation. In the juvenile system, the judge holds a disposition hearing. A disposition is a carefully crafted plan that weighs the safety of the community directly against the youth's cognitive brain development and their capacity for rehabilitation. It's about finding the right treatment, not just the right punishment. Part 4, Waivers to Adult Court. Because while that emphasis on treatment is the ideal, it brings us to a really difficult reality. What happens when a youth commits a crime so severe or so violent that the system decides the juvenile court's rehabilitative tools simply aren't enough? That tension leads us to waivers. This is the mechanism used to transfer a juvenile into the adult criminal court. You absolutely need to know who holds the power to transfer a child in each scenario. First, in a legislative waiver, state law makes it automatic. If a youth reaches a certain age and commits a specific severe offense, boom, they bypass juvenile court entirely. Second, in a prosecutorial waiver, which is also known as a direct file, the district attorney has the immense power and discretion to file the charges directly in adult court. And finally, in a judicial waiver, the judge makes the final discretionary call, but only after holding a formal hearing to review the evidence and the youth's background. This is another classic comprehensive final exam topic. If you get a question asking whether juveniles should ever be tried as adults, a strong essay won't just give a personal opinion. A top-tier answer is going to successfully contrast the mechanics of those 3 waivers against what the Supreme Court has explicitly noted regarding adolescent brain development, reduced culpability, and that historical 1990s fear of the so-called violent superpredator. Okay, Part 5, Rehabilitation and Aftercare. For the vast majority of youth who do remain in the juvenile system, the post-disposition phase is all about intervention. Demographically, while boys account for nearly 3/4 of cases, which is a trend we obviously also see in the adult system, the resulting interventions focus universally on specialized treatment rather than mere incapacitation, regardless of gender. So whether the court is utilizing probation, which is definitely the most common intervention, or short-term boot camps and residential facilities, the focus universally remains on rehabilitation. And just like in the adult corrections models we studied a few weeks ago, the supervision doesn't just end when a placement is over. When an adult is released early from prison, they go on parole. But when a youth completes a stint in a residential facility, they don't just walk free. They are released to what is called aftercare. Aftercare functions exactly like adult parole. It provides community supervision and vital support to ensure the youth successfully reintegrates into society and doesn't just graduate right into the adult criminal system. The way juvenile aftercare and probation work perfectly illustrates the central theme of our entire criminal justice course. I mean, think about it. Every single chapter we've covered asks the exact same underlying question. How do we balance the immense tension between offender accountability, meaningful rehabilitation, and ultimate public safety? It's like a giant puzzle. The juvenile system simply shifts the scales, heavily, in favor of rehabilitation. Finally, Part 6, Final Exam Review. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, so let's wrap up this masterclass with a rapid-fire review of your absolute highest yield concepts. If you only study one thing tonight before your exam, make it this specific list of concepts. Ensure you can vividly explain Parens' Patriae and easily define a status offense. Be ready to trace that evolution of due process from Kent all the way through Graham. Make sure you can correctly contrast juvenile terms like adjudication and disposition against adult trials and sentencing. And finally, know exactly who holds the power when we are talking about legislative, prosecutorial, and judicial waivers. As you head into your exam, keep asking yourself this fundamental question. Are we truly saving children and protecting their best interests, or are we just delaying their inevitable entry into the adult system? If you can articulate how the courts try to balance those scales for our most vulnerable offenders, you are going to be perfectly prepared. Best of luck on your final. You've totally got this.